And we'll now talk about, in this next section, about fire safety provisions and some of the changes there, about the changes for the cantilevering separating walls that Tim mentioned in his presentation about one of the systems available, about the introduction of the condensation management provisions, everyone's favourite subject of energy efficiency. I'll talk about the product documentation requirements or evidence of suitability changes and the changes to the Australian standards. So a fair bit to get through in this next session. So I'll try and get through everything, but I'm again happy for questions. If you can I'll open up questions at certain times. And just a reminder, if you turn your phones on silent, if you could, please, and we'll get started. So in terms of the fire safety provisions, or the provisions in Part 371, it's now been split into 4 parts. And 371 now deals with the material requirements, and in the very few circumstances where the non-combustibility or there's requirements for fire hazard property requirements for a house. Part 372 deals with the requirements for where you need to have a wall needs to have some fire separation or have a fire resistance level. The requirements now for separating walls and floor systems, and then the last one around the garage top dwellings, which is your provisions for your FONSI flats or your surveillance units, which I know there's been a bit of those in the ACT constructed, which were incorporated into the code a few years ago as a deemed to satisfy. So probably the big ones here are the introduction of the deemed to satisfy solution for cantilevering separating walls. The construction, there's been some clarification added for about where an external wall may terminate and have infill flashing. Some provisions about the allowable encroachment provisions, and some new scenarios added for where an external wall requires fire separation, and more pictures and figures added there in terms of some questions that are raised. Does this one, how about this one if it's offset, and things like this. So one of the changes is about the cantilever separating walls. Has anyone seen these cantilever separating walls come across your desk or built them? Or, obviously this is not one that everyone does, but where you might have your garage inset from the first story and things like that. Has anyone come across your offices? We're seeing it more and more across, particularly in new estates where you've got row of townhouses and things like that, and for planning, trying to have that articulation of the streetscape. I can't believe I just said articulation of the streetscape. I sound like a planner, don't I? No offence to planners in the room. Yeah. So we're starting to see this emerge more and more, and as Tim mentioned, it was one of those ones where the code was some grey area on whether you could have a cantilever separating wall or not. And the ABCB have now adopted this as a deemed to satisfy solution. So here's the solution, but before I get into it, I probably just want to talk about, and I'll go back to this one so rather than try and confuse people, is the difference for the purpose of the National Construction Code on what is an external wall versus what is a separating wall. So an external wall for the purpose of the BCA or NCC is just that. It's the external wall of the building. So it would need to meet all your requirements for an external wall. Fire if it's within 900mm of the boundary, weatherproofing, structural, all that for an external wall. Whereas a separating wall or a party wall is a wall that's common to 2 dwellings. Okay, so very different for the purpose of the NCC, and it's important to understand that context. So, for instance, a zero lot line wall is not a separating wall. A zero lot line wall is generally an external wall and needs to meet those requirements of an external wall, whereas separating wall is that wall I mentioned again about where it's a wall that's common to 2 properties, or it's separating those 2 properties. You can have a scenario, and I don't want to confuse it, where it's a separating wall up to one part and then there's an external wall above that, but we don't need to go there. But there is that scenario. But it is important to understand that context, and when I go through some of these other slides, you'll probably understand why I separate the 2. So this separating wall, the question was raised is, can you have it separating? Because the BCA did say that, and this was pretty clear really, that the external wall, for a separating wall, it needs to start at the footings and extend up all the way up to the underside of the roofing, or if it extends past the roofing when you have combustible roofing. So it couldn't cantilever out under the deemed to satisfy. But as this is an emerging area, more and more systems doing this, being encouraged through planning, as I mentioned, about that streetscape. And so a new solution's been incorporated into the code and treating it as if it was a scenario that would be applicable in a Volume 1 sense and similar provisions applying. So this new figure's been incorporated into the code. So this separating wall, be it the one on the ground floor or the one on the first floor, would still need to meet your separating wall requirements, either having a 60, 60, 60 fire resistance level, okay? But what it's now capturing is that horizontal projection, okay? Treating that horizontal projection from a fire safety perspective. And what it requires is to have 1.8 metres out from either side of that separating wall on the horizontal projection for that underside of that area to be treated, such as a fire-rated plaster board or a fibre cement board or a ceiling with a resistance to incipient spread seal of fire, and some other options that do exist. So there's a number of different options it could use, but only requires 1.8 out. Why only 1.8 out? Because it takes on that provision of the code where you might have two Class 1s on the same allotment where you need to have the 1.8 separation. So obviously you wouldn't see a scenario where you'd build out 1.8 with one part of the, a ceiling system, and then you'd stop and start something else, particularly when a lot of these are rows of, in a new estate where you might have 15 of them in an allotment. So you're not going to have a 1.8 little bit of plasterboard or something else that doesn't need to have fire resistant, then 1.8 a fire protective board. You'd have that same requirement, but it didn't need to say that in the code because that would be increasing stringency from what that requirement of the 1.8 separation where you have the two Class 1s on the dwelling. So we'll probably see more and more of this, and this provides an appropriate deemed to satisfy solution than rather than having to go through the performance pathway for something that's very commonly done. As I mentioned, and Tim mentioned it before, there are a number of proprietary systems out there in the market and proprietary ceiling systems that you could use. So you'll probably see more and more of them advertised going forward. Some of them probably could still be used as a performance solution for a zero lot line wall, but for the separating wall, it's deemed to satisfy solution. One of the other changes as well, and I will talk about this later, but while I've got this figure here, is that, as I mentioned, a separating wall, the BCA says that it needs to be 60, 60, 60 a tested system. It now also allows to have a 90mm masonry wall as that separating wall system as a deemed to satisfy solution. So rather than having to verify does a masonry wall system meet a 60, 60, 60 system, I don't think they've ever been tested for that because they've never been required to be. For an external wall, it's always allowed that as an option to use your 60, 60, 60 or use a 90mm masonry wall. So now this has been adopted as an option as part of your separating wall requirements as well. Another change around the allowable encroachment provisions, and really it's more of a clarification. And this is another one of those ones where the question was raised where you have, so the allowable encroachment provisions for context. So as I mentioned before, where a wall's within 900mm of the boundary, it needs to have an FRL or use those other options I mentioned. Otherwise, but the code does allow for where you don't build within that 900mm, but to allow some elements within that allowable encroachment area, such as eaves. It has other things like pipes and, down pipes and an air conditioning unit, other things that just are natural things that really aren't going to contribute to fire spread. But allow for the eaves. And one of the questions was raised was the provision had some requirements where you had combustible elements in your eaves, and then it had other provisions where if you use full non-combustible materials, and the question was raised, does that allow you to build all the way up to the boundary if you use non-combustible materials? Or does it just allow you to extend your fascia and your gutter into that, beyond the 450mm? And that's what the actual the correct interpretation was. Not to say if you use non-combustible materials, you can go all up to the boundary. Because if you think about that, if you do it all up to the boundary on your side, and your neighbour did the opposite, you'll have a separation of maybe a finger between the two of them, and that's not what the code's seeking to achieve. The code's trying to seek to achieve that 1.8 separation between the two dwellings 900mm on your side, 900mm on your side, where these eaves would probably allow that 900mm in between. So it's been clarified in these figures about what the correct interpretation means. If you look at my two figures, it's a bit silly because one of it says if you use combustible elements, you can't have your fascia in that space, but if you use non-combustible elements, you could have your fascia and your gutter in it. So, you know, for a metal fascia gutter, what is it? A couple of mil thick to allow you to extend that. So it's more about that clarification on no, you can't build all the way up to the boundary if you use non-combustible materials. If you build all up to the boundary, then you'd need to use the provisions for where the external wall is within that 900mm space and meet those requirements, and there are some different options you've got allowable for when you use those provisions. And in regards to that provision about the construction of external walls, some other changes have been incorporated here. The Victorian Building Authority did an audit on their proactive inspections, and if anyone sees the VBA's e-users that have their vehicles parked out the front of a building site and saying they're proactive inspections, it's always very interesting. And they did these, and they went round and they had this scenario where people were building up to say 1.8 with brickwork, and then doing above that, maybe putting a fibre cement or doing a corrugated metal for the rest of the wall up to the underside of the roof, or for the fascia. And they went round and they issued a number of notices about calling this stuff non-compliant. And we've said, well, that's not necessarily exactly what the code says. The code does have some provisions around this that could allow it. But their view was that saying that there's 4 options in the construction of external walls in the code currently, and that doesn't reflect any of those 4 options. So therefore it would need to be done as a performance solution, not deemed to satisfy. So we asked the question there, well, there is a number of scenarios where you might just do the bricks up to X height and then you have a flushing to cover in the rest of that space with, you know, cut bricks and other things like that, and utilisation space and other things. And so what would be the acceptable level? And what they've now clarified through the code is that you could have 200mm if you've got a flushing from between the gutter and your cladding below, the bricks, or a tested system, so a 200mm space. It's written into that clause there. It probably doesn't align with that readability principle I mentioned earlier today about a long-winded sentence, but that's essentially what it's trying to say. Saying it either needs to go up to the underside of the gutter itself or have a 200mm clearance as a maximum between the cladding and the gutter itself, provided you've got a flushing that's considered non-combustible. I mentioned that change before about the separating walls, about the 60-60-60 or having a 90mm masonry, so that's just showing that on the screen there. Another change around the smoke alarm provisions. Another one of those areas of the code that always seems to be under review is the smoke alarm provisions. And another one of those questions was raised is with changing floor plates in a number of dwellings now, where you might have a parent's room and the parents retreat in one part of the house, and then you have all the kids' rooms in the other part of the house, do you need smoke alarms in those separate areas? Having a 3-year-old daughter, I would fully concur that having a parent's side of the house and having a kid's side of the house is a very good idea. But so the question was raised is, do you need to have a smoke alarm in those 2 separate areas? And the code says where you have hallways or rooms connecting, where people may sleep, you need to have those smoke alarms in the separate areas, and now that's been clarified. So also, if you remember, the provisions were incorporated a couple of years ago for the interconnection of the smoke alarms. So they're not just putting the additional alarm, it also needs to be interconnected. When I introduced this change up in Queensland, not another one, because they're already requiring smoke alarms in every bedroom, plus the ones in the hallways, and plus being photoelectric smoke alarms. So they're like, another one. This is going to be the most lit up house, and there'd be so many smoke alarms that you're going to be sounding the alarms all the time. So that's one change. Another one of those to look out for, to not get captured. And that changing floor plates, I think we're seeing it more and more in terms of standard designs now, having those 2 different areas of the house having the smoke alarms. Another change has been a requirement in laundries and toilets, or laundries and water closets, that it no longer will be required to have a waterproof junction between the wall and the floor. It only now needs to be a water-resistant junction. This is something that has been done in South Australia for the best part of the last 15 years, and more of you were coming to HA and others and saying, hey, with moves to polished concrete slabs and going out being more and more contemporary, with some more of the materials being used, the difficulty of having the waterproof junction in these areas, European laundries or laundry cupboards as well, and the question was raised, does it need to be a waterproof junction, which might mean a 50mm water stop and this type of thing? Can it just be a water resistant junction? If you look at the other parts to the room, the walls don't need to have any protection, it don't need to be waterproof or water resistant. The wall junctions and joints don't need to be. The floor itself only needs to be water resistant. Why can't it just be a type 4 junction under 3740 using a sealant, or using a tile skirt and a sealant, and that was now adopted into the code. I think moving into that, more and more of those European laundries and contemporary materials, it was considered to be a reasonable change, and and also these areas aren't the sort of areas that are subject to frequent water on them as if it was a bathroom. So another change is around the sound insulation provisions, and you'll notice this figure, and it's a figure for illustrative purposes really only. You wouldn't see a wall like this built, but previously the code had a table with the sound insulation provisions that talked about when you needed to have discontinuous construction, or where you could have single skin construction, and how you needed to treat it differently, where you might have a habitable room on one side to a bathroom or a kitchen on the other side, and where the different separation requirements apply. So this applies to a separating wall, not to external wall or zero lot line walls. It's only applicable to separating walls. And now this provides a bit better clarity than that table. And as I acknowledge, you're never going to build one that's going to be single skin, discontinuous, single skin, discontinuous, but it's there for illustrative purposes to try and clarify the provision. One of the bits I will draw your attention to, that there's been some differing views around this one about the separation of a Class 10A, which might be a garage on one side and having to have separation requirements to a habitable room on the other side. That was not clear before, and now it's been clarified that that would require separation. Other changes to this one also includes that you could now have a sound insulated ceiling in lieu of your separating, or unless in lieu of having your sound insulated wall extending to the underside of the roof above. From a fire safety perspective, that wall would still need to go all the way up, but from a sound insulation provision, it could allow you to use a sound insulated ceiling rather than having that separating wall with the discontinuous construction and other things into that space. A lot of the time that would still be done based on how you build the wall, but that's given, and that was something that was in Volume 1 that wasn't in Volume 2, and HA and others had raised some questions whether that could be incorporated into the code, and that was put forward. Another change in here, and this is one of those parts that really I think was a carryover. It was written for Volume 1 and then which is adopted into Volume 2. It had a requirement that you needed to stagger your joins on either side of the separating wall, so you couldn't have the same joins lining up. So if you imagine the scenario on a separating wall between your dwelling compared to the dwelling could be built by someone else on the other side of your wall, you're not supposed to have a horizontal plasterboard join that's the same level as the other side. I don't think anyone's ever followed that one too much. Imagine putting a 600mm sheet on your side and cutting and putting a 12, and then your side putting a 12. On your side of the wall, commonly you're going to have, a lot of the sound insulated options will require you to stagger the joins on your side of the wall, or you might have horizontal, then have verticals. You can do that, but having it on opposite sides of the wall, I don't think we've ever really had that one enforced too heavily, and it'd be one of those ones is what purpose is it serving? Where it's in a Class 1 context, obviously much easier because your different SOUs are being built at the same time. So that was one of those changes that's been incorporated, and also about some of the changes about how you treat surfaces in a sound insulated wall. So moving into the condensation management provisions, and I talked earlier today about about the performance requirement and the verification method. Now I'm talking about the deemed to satisfy provisions. And as I mentioned at the outset, the changes are there to minimise the impact of condensation in buildings, rather than trying to say you do this and you won't see any condensation appearing in the buildings. The provisions are really about two parts. One is to trying to ensure that we're not having a build-up of moisture in the wall cavity system that can't escape, and which has two parts to it. One is to, having health impacts about the occupants of the building, increased moisture in that building, and then also about the degradation of the building materials themselves. The other part to the provisions is about ducting and getting that moist air out of the building itself, and there's a few different options there. So the new provisions will require the installation of vapour permeable membranes in certain climate zones, which is particularly all the climate zones in Canberra and probably in parts of New South Wales, depending on where you are, but that a number of those ones will be required. About the ducting of exhaust fans and things like this, or ventilation of roof space requirements, and an adoption of the new provisions 4200 Part 1 and Part 2. This is likely, as I mentioned earlier, that these are probably going to be the first of a suite of changes for condensation provisions in buildings, where we'll likely see more stuff going forward, where the stuff for 2019 are more those sort of generic, sort of simple DTS solutions that you could probably say. New explanatory information has been incorporated to that exact point that I made before about the provisions are there to minimise the impact and about managing it. Similar to how we do termite management provisions in the code, where it's about managing termites. It acknowledges that they can't completely ensure that they won't appear or do damage. It's about minimising the impact. HA and others really pushed for this one ourselves, was to ensure that we didn't want to get to the scenario where you guys go and build these things or certify them, design them, and then 3 years later, all these condensation issues appear in the building, and then you're held liable for this stuff when you've followed what's in the code. We wanted to really make it clear that this is about minimising. It can't completely stop condensation from appearing. And we thought that was really important to make that clear in the provisions. So in terms of the provisions, here's the first clause, which is 3872, which is about the membranes itself. And it talks about that the pliable membrane installed in the external wall, so not roof, external wall, needs to comply with NCS 4200 Part 1, which is the material standard, and be installed in accordance with AS 4200 Part 2, which is the installation standard. And it must be vapour permeable for climate zones 6, 7 and 8, and located on the exterior side of the of the external wall, in terms of the construction itself, not external, but external of behind the cladding. It does give some concessions around for single skin masonry or single skin concrete, that you wouldn't require it for those circumstances, because where could you put it? There's nowhere to put it for those scenarios. But then it also goes to saying where a pliable membrane is not installed in the external wall, then the external wall layer may be separated from water sensitive material by a drained cavity. Not the best drafting of a clause, this one, I won't lie. So essentially with that one, it's sort of trying to talk about if you don't use a pliable membrane, then it would need to be separated by a drain cavity, which could be a brick veneer wall. Our recommendation for this one though would be that if you're going to put, sarking in the wall, particularly in the colder climate zones, to use those vapour permeable membranes regardless of what might be there in terms of what you could do, in terms of a drain cavity. A lot of the code, the code doesn't ever require you to install sarking in the first place. There's only a couple of parts to the code that does require you to do it. A lot of you would do it from the perspective of, as part of meeting your total R values for your external walls for your energy efficiency purposes. Or it might be, where you might do it as part of your wall cladding system, as part of it might even be a manufacturer's requirement as part of their system to have that membrane there. So where you put it in, it would need to be a vapour permeable in those climate zones. And as I said, it could be, wouldn't need it if you put it, it wouldn't need to be vapour permeable if you have those drain cavity. but HA's recommendation would be, regardless, encouraging you to use those vapor permeable membranes because, from a condensation perspective, they do provide, some better protection and things like that, allowing the building to breathe. There's also some other parts of the provisions is around the discharge of exhaust systems, and talks about where you have a bathroom fan or something like that, that would need to be either ducted to the outside or be into the roof space that would need to be ventilated. There was already some stuff in the code around the ducting requirements, but they were fairly qualitative, and it said if you had an unsarked roof, you didn't need to do it. If you went into the roof space and it was, adequately ventilated, but didn't really give a lot of, or open eaves, and didn't really give a lot of quantification or prescription around what that actually meant. Now this is much more prescriptive. And if you go into the roof space, then there's all these calculations you need to do in terms of the roof space area, in terms of its ventilation. It doesn't mandate for kitchen range hoods that they need to be ducted to the outside based on an airflow rate. It will for some, but some of those sort of self-reticulating systems would be under that threshold of the 40 litres per second. But again, one of those ones we really encourage, if you can, duct. It always is better to get that moisture out of the building. It's not always achievable for all circumstances, where you might have a kitchen on a ground floor, you might have, a concrete slab, it might be centrally located, it might present some difficulties. If you're doing row houses, it also could present some difficulties, but where you can, really encourage you to do that, because it does, getting that moisture out of the building is highly, advisable really. From a Class 1 perspective, from a Volume 1 perspective and Class 2 buildings, and I'll talk about this afternoon, those changes, that does apply differently for the actual range hoods for kitchens in a Class 2 building, where it will require you duct to the outside. So some of the changes to the barriers and handrails provisions. The provisions have been through one of those reviews. Again, it's one of those sections that just always seems like it's under review, doesn't it? Every time you hear code changes, stairs and balustrades and handrails, there's always one that's under review. But there's been some new provisions to clarify when a barrier is required for a retaining wall. There's also revision of the means to determine when a barrier is required, rather than just having that blunt mechanism of, where it's greater than a metre. It talks about where there's the ability to fall greater than a metre, so it gives a bit more, more of a sensible measure around that one. It clarifies that handrails need to be continuous, where we're starting to see the scenario of a handrail going up one side of a building, one side of the stair flight, or even stopping on part of the stair flight, then moving to the other side of it, and then moving back. So trying to stop those scenarios and have a continuous, with smaller dwelling sizes and things like that, that has something we're starting to see a few of those different and interesting stair designs. There still is some provisions around that when you can break a handhold and things like that, when you have your newel post and stuff like that, but some greater clarification around that. Also, a provision has been incorporated to require handrails to a stair that serves a Class 10 building, where that is greater than a metre, and change in elevation to have that handrail where it was previously exempt. If you think about, the garage or something like this, or a deck that might be serving the main purpose of the actual, the primary pedestrian entrance, it could have been through the Class 10 and not to have that handrail there. I think a lot of you would already be putting those handrails on and probably already thought it was a requirement anyway, where it's over a metre, to have that handrail. It's now been clarified. Another change has been about separating the requirements for barriers for openable windows in bedrooms from those in other rooms. And I'll talk about that one in a second, but it doesn't, what I just want to clarify with that one, it doesn't mean that those openable restriction requirements that apply to bedrooms have now been extended to windows in other rooms. The provisions haven't changed in that respect. It's still just for bedrooms. There already were provisions for protection for windows that were greater than 4 metres above the surface beneath for other rooms, and it's just now separated those requirements to make them clearer, so it doesn't, hopefully to result in not having that confusion. and lots of new figures and explanatory information to assist the application. So one of the new figures has been around barriers to retaining walls. And this was always a requirement in the code for retaining walls and to have barriers where they form part of the delineated path of access to the building itself, to have a handrail there. It's one of those ones that's probably always been a bit of a difficult one to understand, and so the figure's been incorporated there to try and assist in trying to highlight that certain retaining walls will need a barrier where they're actually forming part of the principal entrance or the entrance into the dwelling itself. Not for those retaining walls that are up in the garden, a tiered sort of situation. They generally they're not captured by this. It's those ones that are forming part of the access to the dwelling itself. It's been funny, that one. Having this slide and the new figure has been getting a lot of questions on that one around the country, where people have probably always struggled with when does a retaining wall require a barrier or not. And this is probably highlighting it more so, and I think probably might lead to more questions rather than actually necessarily answering them all. So another change, as I mentioned, about those separating of the requirements for the protection in bedrooms as opposed to other rooms, and a number of new figures have been incorporated to clarify those requirements. A lot of those figures were out of the ABCB's advisory note or practice note on those openable window provisions, which were developed a few years ago. And rather than being in an advisory note, being in the code itself, which makes it better and simpler and provides that clarity with the provisions. A new part has also been incorporated, Part 310, which follows that part I mentioned earlier about the Part 2.7, and this brings together those ancillary provisions and additional construction requirements. This is the one that contains those, essentially, if you think about it, that provisions of Part 3.0 up to 3.9 of Volume 2 deal with your buildings that are just, in wind speed less than N3, meet with geo limitations, doesn't have any additional flood hazard requirements, earthquake area requirements. It's not in an alpine area. It's not in a bushfire prone area. It's just in your normal areas of building. This part then has those additional provisions that apply when you're in those areas that apply on top of the common provisions across the rest of the code. There's also some ancillary provisions there. None of this has really changed in terms of new provisions there. Most of it is just being relocated here to make it more logical in how the code's set up. One of the new provisions, though, is Part 310.6, which is attachment of decks and balconies to external walls of buildings. And this part was incorporated. We've probably all seen some of those scenarios where overloading of decks and decks have sheared off the external wall of the building. You've had collapses and things like that. So a minister in New South Wales wrote to the Building Codes Board a number of years ago and asked them to look into this, and in particular about the attachment methods of the deck or balcony to the external wall of the building. The provisions really are fairly limited in what they offer in terms of prescriptive solutions. It really has application to where you're attaching to a core filled masonry wall. But there is some provisions there for attaching wailing plates, both to timber or steel buildings, but they are highly conservative. So you could still have your design done by an engineer, which might come up with a more workable and reasonable solution for the particular scenario. I think one of the most useful parts of it is this explanatory information, which clarifies what we all know, that you shouldn't be attaching wailing plates and other things to hollow core brickwork. In those circumstances, unless there's a really engineered design scenario, you should be looking at trying to include another row of stumps or piers rather than trying to attach it to that external wall. Where it's a wire cut brick or a hollow core brick, what sort of support will that provide? So another one of those areas, there's a new part to the code. And that clarifies a lot of the stuff I just mentioned there, that it's one of a number of options you could use.